The man they called Bertie waited 60 years for a crown. 60 years of shooting parties, horse races, 7-course dinners, and a parade of mistresses that would make a French king blush. When Edward VII finally sat on the British throne in 1901, he was already closer to death than to any fresh ambition, a wheezing, overfed 60-year-old who somehow managed to modernize the monarchy in under a decade. But behind the cigar smoke and the diplomatic handshakes, behind the state banquets and the entente cordiale, Edward left behind something messier than any treaty or alliance: a family. 6 children. One died before he could draw a full day's breath. Another dropped dead at 28, and historians still argue about whether his death saved the British Empire or merely spared it an awkward coronation. A third rewired the monarchy for the 20th century, ruling through a world war, a general strike, and the collapse of nearly every other dynasty in Europe. One daughter married a man nearly 2 decades older and watched him die on a foreign shore after their ship broke apart in the waters off Morocco. Another never married at all, trapped in her mother's drawing room like a songbird in a cage, lined with silk and resentment. And the youngest daughter, the tomboy they nicknamed Harry, wound up Queen of Norway almost by accident, chosen not for her political skill but because her father happened to be the most powerful king in Europe. This is the story of Edward VII's children. The heirs, the spares, the forgotten, and the unlucky. Some rose to the occasion, some never got the chance, and one barely had time to open his eyes before the world took him back. Albert Edward arrived screaming into Buckingham Palace on November 9, 1841, and the trouble began almost immediately. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had a plan for their firstborn son, the Coburg Plan, an educational regime so punishing in its ambitions that it would have crushed a genius, let alone a boy who found books about as exciting as watching paint dry on a Prussian wall. They wanted a polymath, a second Albert, a prince who could quote Schiller and debate constitutional law before breakfast, who could paint watercolors and dissect philosophical arguments with equal ease. What they got was Bertie, rebellious, restless, easily bored, and prone to the kind of tantrums that sent tutors fleeing to the nearest pub. The experiment failed spectacularly. Bertie did not become a scholar. He became a socialite, arguably the greatest socialite in European history, a man whose genius for pleasure was matched only by his genius for making powerful friends, and his near-total inability to sit still in a library. But before the dinner parties and the racehorses came the incident that poisoned his relationship with his parents and cast a shadow over the next 4 decades of his life. In 1861, while Bertie trained with the army at the Curragh camp in Ireland, his fellow officers smuggled an actress named Nellie Clifton into his tent. The affair was brief, unremarkable by the standards of military camps, and would have been forgotten entirely if it hadn't leaked to the palace. Prince Albert, already gravely ill with what would prove to be typhoid fever, dragged himself to Cambridge to deliver a furious reprimand in person. The journey exhausted him. Weeks later, Albert died. Queen Victoria, consumed by grief so total it bordered on madness, needed someone to blame, someone specific, someone she could point to and say, "You did this." She chose Bertie. "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder," she wrote to her eldest daughter, Princess Victoria. That sentence landed like a brand on bare skin. For the rest of Victoria's reign, nearly 4 more decades, Bertie lived under its shadow. She denied him access to state papers. She excluded him from government business. She treated him less like an heir to the greatest empire on earth, and more like a mildly embarrassing nephew who kept showing up uninvited to family dinners. The Prince of Wales, heir to the throne of the United Kingdom and the dominions beyond the seas, was forbidden from doing anything useful with his position. So he did what any exiled prince with unlimited money and no responsibilities would do. He built a world of his own, and he built it with a thoroughness that would have impressed even his disapproving mother. The Marlborough House set became the center of London's social universe, a glittering, chaotic circle of aristocrats, actresses, financiers, jockeys, and assorted hangers-on who revolved around Bertie like satellites orbiting a jovial, overfed planet. He ate with legendary enthusiasm. 5 meals a day was standard, each one a multi-course production that would leave a modern cardiologist weeping into his stethoscope. He smoked 12 enormous cigars and 20 cigarettes between sunrise and bedtime. He collected racehorses, lovers, and public scandals with equal dedication and roughly equal discrimination. The scandals were spectacular. In 1870, he appeared as a witness in the Mordaunt divorce case, forced to deny under oath in open court before a fascinated nation that he had committed adultery with Lady Mordaunt. The press savaged him. Republicans demanded the abolition of the monarchy. 21 years later, the Tranby-Croft Baccarat scandal dragged him back into the public gaze when a guest at a country house party was caught cheating at cards, and Bertie, who had been running the illegal game himself, became the first heir to the throne to testify in court since the 15th century. Both incidents chipped away at the monarchy's prestige and handed ammunition to every radical, Republican, and nonconformist preacher who had ever questioned whether Britain truly needed an hereditary head of state. Neither scandal slowed Bertie down for a single evening. Then, against all expectations, against the expectations of his mother, his ministers, and probably Bertie himself, the crown actually landed on his head. Victoria died on January 22, 1901, and Bertie became King Edward VII at the age of 59, an age when most men of his era were already measuring themselves for coffins. What followed shocked everyone who had written him off as a dilettante in a top hat. Edward revived the state opening of Parliament, a ceremony Victoria had neglected for years, preferring to mourn in seclusion rather than perform the pageantry her people craved. He brought the monarchy back into the public sphere, understood instinctively that a king in the 20th century needed to be seen, needed to perform, needed to give the nation something to look at beyond a closed door at Windsor Castle. And he deployed his greatest personal asset, his extraordinary network of royal relatives scattered across every throne in Europe, the product of decades of socializing at an international level, as a diplomatic weapon of remarkable effectiveness. Edward loathed his nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, with a personal intensity that transcended politics and entered the realm of pure familial contempt. Wilhelm was everything Edward despised, a preening, insecure bully whose theatrical militarism and desperate need for attention grated on every nerve in Edward's pleasure-loving body. That personal animosity, simmering across state dinners and family funerals for years, helped tilt British foreign policy away from Germany and toward France, a shift that would reshape the map of Europe and send millions of young men into trenches within a decade. Edward's triumphant 1903 visit to Paris demonstrated exactly the kind of diplomacy he excelled at: personal, instinctive, and utterly immune to the cautious hedging of professional diplomats. He arrived in a city that greeted him with open hostility, the French public, still nursing the wounds of fashoda and colonial rivalry, jeered the English king's carriage. Edward responded not with offense but with warmth, flattery, and a perfectly timed compliment to a French actress he recognized in the crowd. By the time he left Paris, the jeers had become cheers, and the diplomatic groundwork had been laid for the Entente Cordiale of 1904, the alliance between Britain and France that would anchor both nations when the Great War erupted 4 years after Edward's death. Edward VII died of severe bronchitis on May 6, 1910 at Buckingham Palace. He had reigned for barely 9 years, yet he left behind a monarchy transformed, visible, accessible, and politically relevant in ways Victoria's decades of seclusion had never permitted. He also left behind 5 surviving children, each shaped in different ways by a father who was charming in ballrooms, formidable at dinner tables, complicated behind closed doors, and almost always absent from the nursery. The firstborn arrived early, and he never quite caught up. Prince Albert Victor, known to his family as Eddie, entered the world on January 8, 1864, at Frogmore House, premature and fragile, blinking into existence with the reluctance of someone who already sensed that the world expected more from him than he would ever be able to deliver. From infancy, Eddie moved through life at a pace that alarmed everyone responsible for his development. His tutor, John Neal Dalton, the same Dalton who would later raise a son of his own, the Labour politician Hugh Dalton described the young prince's mind as abnormally dormant. That phrase deserves a moment of attention. Not slow, not undeveloped, not merely behind schedule, abnormally dormant. The clinical precision of those two words tells you everything about how the adults around Eddie perceived him, as a problem to be solved, a deficiency to be corrected, a prince-shaped void that needed to be filled with enough education, discipline, and suitable companionship to pass muster at a coronation. Eddie was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. That meant he stood second in line to the British throne after his father, and the implications of his mental sluggishness terrified the political establishment with a force that no amount of polite euphemism could soften. A charming, slow-witted prince was manageable charming. Slow-witted princes had been a feature of European royalty for centuries. A charming, slow-witted king, ascending the throne at a moment when constitutional government was growing more complex by the year, was a disaster waiting to unfold in full public view. The solution, such as it was, involved yoking Eddie to his younger brother George, a sharper, livelier, more obedient boy who thrived on structure and discipline in ways that Eddie conspicuously did not. They studied together, ate together, quarreled together, and in 1877 were packed off to sea as naval cadets aboard HMS Britannia. From 1879 to 1882, the brothers circumnavigated the globe on HMS Bacchante, a 3-year voyage designed to educate them through exposure to the wider world, different cultures, different climates, different ports of call that might spark in Eddie some flicker of the curiosity that came so naturally to George. George flourished, discovering in the Navy a life he genuinely loved. Eddie drifted, amiable and vacant, through port after exotic port, absorbing nothing, retaining less. Back on dry land, Eddie earned the nickname Collar and Cuffs for his fastidious attention to his wardrobe. The elongated collars and extravagant cuffs he favored became his most identifiable characteristic, which tells you something devastating about how little else he offered the public imagination. He was tall, thin, pleasant-looking in a pallid aristocratic way, and almost entirely without initiative. The public found him harmless and vaguely amusing. The palace found him alarming and entirely without solutions. Finding Eddie a wife became a project of genuine national urgency, driven not by any romantic impulse on Eddie's part, but by the cold political calculation that the right bride might supply the backbone, intelligence, and organizational capacity he so obviously lacked. If Eddie could not be made competent, perhaps a competent wife could manage him, and by extension, manage the monarchy when his turn came. The search produced a sequence of near misses that reads like a particularly frustrating episode of a Victorian matchmaking drama, each failure compounding the sense that fate itself was conspiring to leave Eddie alone with his collars and his vacant gaze. First came Princess Alix of Hesse, his cousin, a beautiful and serious young woman with whom Eddie became genuinely infatuated. Alix rejected him flatly in 1889. She had her own convictions, her own stubbornness, and her own destiny, one that would carry her east to Russia as Tsarina Alexandra, wife of Nicholas II, mother of Anastasia, and eventually to a basement room in Yekaterinburg, where a Bolshevik firing squad ended the Romanov dynasty with a volley of bullets and bayonets. Whatever fate Alix chose for herself, and however terribly it ended, it was not Eddie. She saw something in the prince that others tried to paper over with titles and uniforms, and she said no. Next came Princess Hélène of Orléans, and here the story turns genuinely poignant, one of those moments where the gears of history catch on something soft and human before grinding onward. Eddie and Hélène developed a real mutual affection, the kind of connection that surprised everyone who had assumed Eddie incapable of emotional depth. For a brief, hopeful window, it seemed possible that love might accomplish what education and naval discipline had failed to do. Give Eddie purpose, direction, a reason to show up for his own life. But Hélène was Catholic. The Act of Settlement, that pillar of Protestant constitutional law, forbade a Catholic consort for the future king. Hélène, moved by the strength of her feelings, offered to convert to Anglicanism. The Pope refused to grant a dispensation. The romance collapsed in 1890, crushed between the grinding millstones of constitutional law and papal authority, and whatever spark Eddie had briefly shown flickered out with it. Finally, Queen Victoria intervened with the efficiency of a woman who had been arranging royal marriages since before most of her ministers were born. She selected Princess May of Teck, intelligent, disciplined, well-read, possessed of an iron will beneath a calm exterior, and equipped with exactly the steely competence that Eddie lacked in every department. May was not glamorous. She was not romantic. She was, in the blunt assessment of the establishment, useful, and usefulness was what the situation demanded. The engagement was announced in December 1891. The wedding was set for February 1892. Ministers exhaled. Courtiers relaxed. May would manage Eddie. May would manage the monarchy. May would manage everything, and the British Constitution would muddle through. Eddie never made it to the altar. In early January 1892, during the influenza pandemic that had been sweeping across Europe in successive waves since 1889, Eddie fell ill at Sandringham. The flu attacked his already fragile constitution with savage efficiency, and within days it developed into pneumonia. His family gathered around his bed, his parents, his siblings, his fiancée May, watching the heir to the throne slip away in a country house bedroom while a Norfolk winter pressed against the windows outside. On January 14, 1892, 1 week and 6 days after his 28th birthday, Eddie died. The room was crowded with grief. Alexandra, his mother, shattered into 1,000 pieces of operatic, consuming sorrow. "I have buried my angel and with him my happiness," she wrote, and she meant every syllable with the total unguarded sincerity that defined her emotional life. She preserved Eddie's room at Sandringham exactly as he left it, his clothes laid out, his hairbrushes on the dresser, his possessions untouched, turning a bedroom into a shrine, a space frozen in amber where the future king who never was could remain forever young, forever present, forever on the verge of a life he would never live. Alexandra maintained this vigil for years, returning to the room regularly, mourning with a persistence that unsettled her family and impressed upon everyone around her the terrible permanence of her loss. History, with its characteristic lack of sentiment, reached a different verdict. Eddie's death was, by near universal agreement among historians, the luckiest tragedy the British monarchy ever suffered. The word lucky carries an ugliness here applied to the death of a young man who was, by all accounts, kind and harmless, but the political calculation is difficult to argue with. A king who could not concentrate, could not lead, could not inspire confidence in ministers or subjects, would have ascended the throne at the worst possible moment in modern history, on the brink of a world war that demanded exactly the kind of steady, patient, unyielding leadership that Eddie had never once demonstrated in his 28 years of breathing. Instead, the crown passed sideways to the brother who had always been the sharper, steadier one. The monarchy survived. Whether Eddie could have survived the monarchy is a question that will never be answered. 2 posthumous scandals attached themselves to Eddie's name, and both deserve quick disposal. In 1889, police raided a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street in London, discovering that several aristocratic clients, including Lord Arthur Somerset, a member of the Prince of Wales's household, had been patronizing the establishment. Rumors linked Eddie to the brothel almost immediately, but the modern historical consensus holds that no hard evidence places him there. Somerset, facing criminal charges and desperate for any leverage that might halt the investigation, likely fed the Eddie rumors to his lawyer as a form of oblique blackmail against the government. Drop the case, or the Prince of Wales's son gets dragged into the story. The tactic may have worked, the prosecution was quietly curtailed, but it left Eddie's reputation stained by association with a scandal in which he almost certainly played no part. The second and more lurid theory that Eddie was Jack the Ripper surfaced in the 1970s, propelled by a combination of conspiracy-minded journalists and the public's insatiable appetite for royal Gothic horror. It belongs entirely to the realm of fantasy. Court circulars documenting Eddie's whereabouts during the autumn of 1888 place him far from Whitechapel on the nights of every Ripper murder. He was at Balmoral, at Sandringham, at country houses in the shires, anywhere, in short, except the fog-choked alleyways where the killer operated. Eddie was many things: inattentive, dull, unsuited to his destiny. A serial killer prowling the East End of London was not among them. George Frederick Ernest Albert arrived on June 3, 1865 at Marlborough House, and from the beginning he was everything his older brother was not: alert, energetic, obedient to the point of rigidity, and genuinely happy when someone told him exactly what to do and exactly when to do it. Where Eddie floated through life like a well-dressed cloud, George seized structure and held onto it with both hands, as though order itself were a life raft and the sea underneath him were chaos. The Royal Navy became his natural habitat. The rigid schedules, the clear hierarchies, the physical demands, the salt air and the scrubbed decks, and the satisfying certainty that every hour of every day had a designated purpose, all of it suited George's temperament, with a precision that bordered on the biological. He was a born sailor in the way that some men are born soldiers, or born priests. Not because he romanticized the sea, but because the Navy gave him rules, and George thrived on rules the way his father thrived on cigars. George never expected to be king. Second sons of Princes of Wales occupied a comfortable limbo in the Victorian succession, close enough to power to enjoy its considerable privileges, far enough removed to escape its suffocating pressures. George's plan, to the extent that he had one, was simple: a long, steady naval career, a pleasant marriage to someone sensible, a quiet country estate where he could shoot birds and collect stamps and live the uncomplicated life of a well-funded English gentleman. History, as it tends to do with careful plans, had other ideas entirely. In late 1891, just weeks before Eddie's fatal bout of influenza, George himself contracted typhoid, the same disease that had killed his grandfather, Prince Albert, 30 years earlier. The coincidence was not lost on the family. George hovered between life and death while his parents relived the nightmare of Albert's illness, watching another beloved family member burn with the same fever, sweat through the same delirium, teeter on the same precipice. George survived. The family gathered around him in exhausted relief, their gratitude sharpened by memory and by the terrible awareness of how narrowly they had escaped a second loss. Then, barely had George risen from his sickbed, Eddie collapsed. The cruel proximity of these two illnesses, George's survival followed almost immediately by Eddie's death, gave the succession a nightmarish, almost literary quality, as though fate was sorting the brothers with cold deliberation, weighing them against each other and discarding the one it found wanting. With Eddie gone, George became heir presumptive, and the establishment moved with unseemly but entirely understandable haste to secure his future. Princess May of Teck, Eddie's grieving fiancée, was still available. She was still intelligent, still capable, still everything the monarchy needed in a consort. The emotional awkwardness of the situation proposing to your dead brother's fiancée before the mourning period had properly ended was acknowledged, managed, and ultimately overridden by political necessity. George proposed. May accepted. Whether genuine affection existed between them at that early stage is debatable. What is not debatable is that both of them understood their duty and were prepared to perform it without complaint. They married on July 6, 1893, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, and the match that had been engineered out of dynastic convenience became, against the odds and against the cynicism of those who had arranged it, one of the most successful royal marriages in British history. George and May, who took the name Queen Mary upon his accession, were devoted to each other in a steady, undemonstrative way that suited them both perfectly. Theirs was not a passionate romance. It was something more durable, a partnership of complementary strengths, built on mutual respect and deepened by decades of shared experience. George provided the sense of duty, the public steadiness, and the gruff, quarterdeck manner that the nation came to associate with the monarchy itself. Mary provided the intellectual curiosity, the cultural sophistication, the instinct for institutional self-preservation, and the iron will that kept the household running like a well-oiled warship. Together, they produced 6 children: the future, Edward VIII, George VI, Mary Princess Royal, Henry Duke of Gloucester, George Duke of Kent, and John and George raised every one of them with the same naval rigidity that had shaped his own character, apparently unable to distinguish between the bridge of a battleship and a family breakfast table. Whether he actually uttered the famous line, "I am damned well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me," remains a matter of debate that reveals more about the limits of historical evidence than about George himself. The quote traces back to Lord Derby, and many historians suspect it was exaggerated, embellished, or entirely invented by a man who enjoyed a good anecdote more than he respected strict accuracy. But apocryphal or not, the sentiment captured something real and damaging about the George V household. His children grew up in an atmosphere of emotional austerity that bordered on deprivation, disciplined relentlessly, corrected constantly, praised with such extreme rarity that a kind word from their father assumed the proportions of a national holiday. The consequences rippled through the next generation with devastating, well-documented effect, most visibly in the fragile, stammering Duke of York, who would become George VI and spend his reign wrestling with a nervous system shattered by childhood, and in the reckless, pleasure-seeking Prince of Wales, who would become Edward VIII, briefly, before throwing away his crown for a twice-divorced American socialite, and spending the rest of his life wondering whether he had made a catastrophic mistake or the only honest decision of his existence. George inherited the crown on May 6, 1910, the day his father died, and walked immediately into a constitutional crisis that would have tested a monarch twice his intellectual weight. The People's Budget, Lloyd George's radical plan to tax the landed aristocracy to fund social welfare, had provoked a collision between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The Parliament Act of 1911, which stripped the Lords of their veto power, required George's active involvement and forced him to threaten the creation of hundreds of new liberal peers to break the conservative blockade. It was the kind of behind-the-scenes political maneuvering that George's father would have handled with a wink and a dinner invitation. George handled it with grim determination and a permanent frown. Then came the Irish crisis, the suffragette movement, the growing power of organized labor, and then, in the summer of 1914, the guns of August. The Great War confronted George V with a problem no British monarch had ever faced with such brutal directness. His family was German. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, with its unmistakably Teutonic syllables, sat atop a nation sending its sons to die in trenches opposite German soldiers commanded by George's own first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Anti-German sentiment swept through Britain with a savagery that startled even those who had fanned its flames. Dachshunds were kicked in the streets, German-owned shops were ransacked and burned, and H.G. Wells publicly mocked the monarchy's alien and uninspiring court. George's response was radical, irreversible, and brilliantly pragmatic. In 1917, he issued a royal proclamation renouncing all German titles and surnames held by members of the British royal family and adopting the name Windsor, plucked from the ancient castle that symbolized English monarchy at its most enduring, its most rooted, its most defiantly un-German. It was an act of branding genius disguised as a constitutional formality. Kaiser Wilhelm, upon hearing the news, reportedly joked that he looked forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The line was sharp, but George won the exchange in the only way that counted. The House of Windsor endures to this day. The Kaiser's empire did not survive the decade. George navigated the post-war years with the same stubborn, unimaginative steadiness that defined everything he did. The General Strike of 1926, the formation of the first Labour government under Ramsay MacDonald, the collapse of empires across Europe, the rise of Mussolini, and the first stirrings of fascism. Through all of it, George held the monarchy together by sheer force of dependability. He was not brilliant. He was not charismatic. He was not witty, or warm, or particularly kind to the people closest to him. He was reliable, and in an age of revolutionary upheaval, when thrones were toppling from St. Petersburg to Constantinople to Vienna, reliability turned out to be the rarest and most necessary quality a king could possess. His health deteriorated through the early 1930s. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease ravaged his lungs. Decades of heavy smoking had taken their toll, though George, like most men of his generation, would never have connected the habit to the disease. By January 1936, he was fading. On the evening of January 20, his physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, made a decision that would remain secret for 50 years. Dawson administered a lethal injection of cocaine and morphine into the king's distended jugular vein, not to relieve suffering, not as an act of mercy, but to ensure that the death would be announced in the morning edition of the Times rather than in what Dawson called the less appropriate evening journals. George V's final act of public service was performed without his knowledge or consent, timed not to the rhythms of nature but to a newspaper printing schedule. His last words, according to Dawson's private diary, were either "God damn you," directed at the nurse who was administering a sedative he did not want, or, according to the more sentimental tradition preserved by the family, "How is the Empire?" Both versions feel entirely plausible for a man who spent his entire reign balancing blunt irritability with dogged devotion to duty, who loved his empire with genuine feeling and loathed being fussed over by medical professionals with equal conviction. Louise Victoria Alexandra Dagmar arrived on February 20, 1867, at Marlborough House, the third child and eldest daughter of Edward and Alexandra, and she spent the next 63 years trying to disappear from public view with a dedication that amounted to a vocation. In a family of extroverts, a father who dominated every room he entered, a mother whose beauty stopped traffic, siblings who craved attention or at least accepted its inevitability, Louise was the anomaly. Painfully shy, allergic to publicity, happiest when the press forgot she existed and the world left her alone with a book, a dog, or ideally both at once. Her shyness was not the performative modesty of a princess who secretly enjoyed being coaxed into the spotlight. It was genuine, deep, and apparently lifelong a constitutional reticence that no amount of royal training could overcome, and that made her uniquely unsuited to the public demands of her position. Louise did not merely dislike attention. She fled from it with the instincts of a woodland animal hearing the snap of a twig. On July 27, 1889, Louise married Alexander Duff, the 6th Earl of Fife, a Scottish aristocrat 18 years her senior, whose passions ran to fishing, estate management, and the quiet rhythms of Highland life. The age gap raised eyebrows in the press and in the drawing rooms of London, but Louise appears to have been genuinely content with a man whose temperament matched her own preference for privacy. Alexander Duff was not a glamorous figure. He was not witty or fashionable or connected to the Marlborough House set's glittering social world. He was quiet, steady, devoted to his estates, and entirely willing to let his wife vanish into the Scottish countryside without complaint. For Louise, this was enough. It may have been everything. Queen Victoria, satisfied with the match, elevated Fife to a duke on the wedding day, a generous gesture that carried a practical edge, since a dukedom provided a more appropriate rank for the son-in-law of the future King of England. In 1900, a special remainder was granted, allowing the dukedom to pass through the female line, ensuring that Louise and Alexander's two surviving daughters, Alexandra and Maud, could inherit the title. This was an unusual concession, one that recognized both the absence of a male heir and the family's desire to preserve the Fife dignity for future generations. Edward VII named Louise Princess Royal in 1905, the highest honorary rank available to a king's daughter, a distinction that recognized her seniority among the princesses and carried considerable prestige. Louise accepted the title with her characteristic lack of enthusiasm for anything that might attract public attention, filing it away alongside her other honors, like a receipt she would never need to produce. Then came December 1911, and the catastrophe that broke Louise's careful, quiet life apart with the indifference of a wave breaking a rowboat. The family Louise, her husband, and their two daughters boarded the SS Delhi bound for Egypt, a winter holiday of the kind that wealthy Edwardians considered essential for good health, and that doctors prescribed with the breezy confidence of men who had never treated sunstroke. Off the coast of Morocco, the Delhi ran aground. The ship began to take on water. The rescue operation was chaotic, dangerous, and only narrowly successful. The family was hauled from the wreck in heavy seas, battered, soaked, and shaken by the kind of mortal terror that no amount of aristocratic composure could disguise. They survived. All of them made it to shore alive. But the ordeal destroyed what remained of the Duke of Fife's health, with a completeness that his doctors could observe but could not reverse. Alexander had entered the voyage already frail, already carrying the accumulated wear of 62 years, and a constitution that had never been robust. The shipwreck stripped away his remaining reserves. Pleurisy set in almost immediately, an inflammation of the lungs that, in an era before antibiotics, was as much a death sentence as a diagnosis. On January 29, 1912, barely a month after the wreck of the Delhi, Alexander Duff died in Aswan, Egypt, far from the Scottish estates he loved, far from the rivers where he had fished, far from everything that had made his quiet life worth living. Louise retreated even further into seclusion after her husband's death, contracting her already small public existence into something barely visible. For nearly 2 decades, she lived in a shadow world, performing the minimum of royal duties her position demanded, appearing in public only when protocol left her no alternative, and otherwise vanishing behind the walls of her London residence with a completeness that a modern celebrity seeking privacy would find enviable and probably unachievable. She accepted no interviews, courted no photographers, and left behind no memoir, no diary of public record, and no letters that have entered the historical conversation in any meaningful way. Louise died of a gastric hemorrhage on January 4, 1931, at the age of 63. Her passing barely rippled the surface of the national consciousness. Of all Edward VII's children, Louise left the faintest footprint, not because she lacked qualities worth remembering, not because her life was without incident or sorrow, but because she worked with such quiet, persistent determination to ensure that no one was watching when she lived it. Victoria Alexandra Olga Mary Toria, to everyone who knew her, arrived on July 6, 1868, at Marlborough House, and from childhood she displayed the qualities that should have made her life extraordinary: intelligence that her tutors noticed and her family relied upon, a wit so sharp it occasionally drew blood, a mischievous streak that livened up the otherwise stifling atmosphere of royal nurseries, and an appetite for gossip that bordered on the professional. In another family, or another century, or under a mother with a less consuming need for companionship, Toria might have been formidable, a political hostess, a society queen, a force of nature wrapped in silk. In the family she was born into, she became a cautionary tale about what happens when a parent's neediness swallows a daughter's entire future. The architect of Toria's captivity, and she was the architect, however sympathetically we might understand her motives, however much we might recognize the loneliness and deafness and emotional dependency that drove her behavior, was her mother, Queen Alexandra. Beautiful, charming, socially graceful, increasingly isolated by the progressive hearing loss that cut her off from easy conversation, and profoundly, almost pathologically dependent on the people physically closest to her, Alexandra clung to her unmarried daughter with a tenacity that crossed the line from maternal affection into something harder to forgive. Toria became her mother's companion, secretary, social manager, emotional crutch, and daily shield against the loneliness that Alexandra abandoned emotionally by a philandering husband, separated from her married daughters, deafened by a condition she could not control, felt pressing in from every direction. These roles consumed Toria's 20s. They consumed her 30s. They consumed her 40s, and most of her 50s. By the time Alexandra died, Toria had spent the better part of 4 decades performing a job she had never applied for and could never resign from. Marriage prospects appeared on the horizon with the regularity of ships, and each one sank before reaching port. A persistent historical rumor links Toria romantically to Archibald Primrose, the 5th Earl of Rosebery, a widowed former prime minister with the intellect, the social standing, and the personal magnetism to make a plausible match, though historians continue to argue over whether the attachment was genuine, whether a formal proposal was ever made, or whether the entire story is palace gossip elevated to legend by repetition. Other names surface in the biographies: Lord Baring, Grand Duke Alexander of Russia. Each suitor represented a possible escape route, a door that might have opened onto an independent life. None of these courtships progressed beyond the preliminary stage. Biographers overwhelmingly agree on the reason, and their agreement carries the weight of accumulated evidence rather than mere speculation. Alexandra discouraged, delayed, and ultimately prevented any match that would have removed Toria from her household. The queen needed her daughter too desperately to let her go, and Toria, bound by duty, by love, by guilt, and by the crushing weight of royal expectation, could not bring herself to simply leave. The cruelty of this arrangement was compounded by the fact that Toria understood exactly what was happening to her. She was not a passive victim drifting through her own imprisonment in a state of cheerful oblivion. She chafed against her confinement, complained to her siblings with increasing bitterness, and deployed her considerable wit in private observations about the absurdity and injustice of her situation. Toria could see the cage. She could describe its dimensions with precision and dark humor. What she lacked was the ruthlessness, or perhaps the selfishness, required to simply walk out of her mother's house and build an independent life, leaving Alexandra alone with her deafness and her grief and her need. Her closest relationship, and the one that gave her constrained existence its warmest, most sustaining thread, was with her brother George. They spoke on the telephone almost daily, a habit that persisted through George's entire reign, from his accession in 1910 to the final weeks of his life in January 1936. George valued Toria's intelligence and trusted her sharp eye for the social dynamics, the petty rivalries, and the buried resentments that shaped court life and leaked into politics. She functioned as his unofficial intelligence service, delivering unfiltered observations and political gossip with an acid tongue that delighted a brother who rarely heard honest opinions from anyone else. In a family that prized emotional restraint above almost every other virtue, the bond between George and Toria was remarkably open, remarkably affectionate, and remarkably necessary to both of them. Alexandra died on November 20, 1925, at Sandringham, and Toria, now 57 years old, finally tasted something she had spent her entire adult life imagining but had never experienced: freedom. She moved to Coppens, a modest estate in Buckinghamshire, and for the next decade she lived on her own terms for the first time. Whether those years were genuinely happy or merely less constrained than what came before is impossible to determine with certainty. No memoir survives, no diary has been published, and Toria's private thoughts during this belated liberation remain as guarded in death as they were in life. But the change itself from daily companion to a demanding, deaf, elderly queen to sole mistress of her own schedule, her own house, her own mornings, must have been staggering. The freedom lasted barely a decade. On December 3, 1935, Toria died at Coppens. George V, by now gravely ill with a lung disease that would kill him within weeks, received the news with a grief so overwhelming that it staggered even those who knew how close the siblings had been. "No one ever had a sister like her," he wrote, and the sentence carries the weight of 67 years of daily affection, shared confidences, telephone calls, private jokes, and the mutual dependence of two people who understood each other completely in a family where understanding was neither encouraged nor rewarded. Toria's death visibly accelerated George's decline. He outlived her by less than 2 months, dying on January 20, 1936, as though some tether connecting him to life, some reason to keep answering the telephone, keep reading the dispatches, keep showing up for the grinding daily obligations of kingship had been quietly cut, and he lacked either the strength or the desire to hold on without her. Maud Charlotte Mary Victoria arrived on November 26, 1869, at Marlborough House, the youngest of Edward and Alexandra's daughters, and from the earliest accounts of her childhood she was different from her sisters in ways that must have baffled and amused her parents in roughly equal measure. While Louise hid from the world behind closed doors and drawn curtains, and Toria sharpened her tongue in her mother's drawing room with nowhere else to deploy it, Maud climbed trees. She rode horses with the abandon of a girl who had not been informed that princesses were expected to sit still. She threw herself into outdoor life with an energy that earned her the nickname Harry, after Admiral Henry Keppel, a family friend and naval hero whose robust, no-nonsense approach to life she apparently channeled from the moment she could walk. The tomboy princess needed a husband. All princesses needed husbands, whether they wanted them or not, and the family found her one in the approved manner, a cousin, vetted by the family, approved by the queen, and sufficiently royal to satisfy the genealogical requirements, without being so important that the marriage would carry complicated political obligations. On July 22, 1896, Maud married Prince Karl of Denmark, a pleasant, unambitious naval officer whose modest career prospects suited Maud perfectly. She anticipated a quiet life, the wife of a minor Danish prince, dividing her time between Copenhagen and her beloved Sandringham, attending to dogs and horses and the gentle rhythms of a Scandinavian existence, mercifully far from the spotlight that had roasted her father and imprisoned her sister. It was a reasonable expectation. It was also, as it turned out, entirely wrong. In 1905, Norway voted to dissolve its union with Sweden, a constitutional earthquake that had been rumbling beneath the surface of Scandinavian politics for decades. The newly independent nation needed a king, a constitutional monarch who would provide stability, international legitimacy, and the kind of dynastic prestige that young nations crave when they are trying to establish themselves among older, more powerful neighbors. The Norwegian parliament, scanning the available inventory of European princes with the pragmatism of shoppers comparing produce, settled on Karl of Denmark. The logic was straightforward and almost entirely unsentimental. Karl was Scandinavian, which mattered for domestic acceptance. He was connected to the Norwegian royal house through his father's lineage, which provided historical continuity. And, most importantly, though this calculation was never stated so bluntly in the official correspondence, he was married to Maud, daughter of Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India, which meant that choosing Karl came with the unspoken but clearly understood protection of the British Empire. Norway, a young nation carving out its independence between the much larger powers of Sweden, Russia, and Germany, could do considerably worse than to have the most powerful monarch on earth as a de facto guarantor of its sovereignty and a father-in-law to its king. Karl accepted the crown, took the name Håkon VII in a deliberate nod to Norway's medieval kings, and Maud found herself catapulted from the comfortable anonymity of a minor Danish princess into the conspicuous, demanding, and entirely unexpected role of Queen of Norway. She handled the transition with a grace that surprised those who had known her primarily as a sporty English girl with muddy boots and an aversion to formal dinners, though she never fully surrendered the English identity that had shaped her first 26 years. Throughout her decades as Queen of Norway, Maud spent months every year at Appleton House on the Sandringham estate, a pattern that raised eyebrows in Oslo and occasionally irritated Norwegian nationalists who felt their queen should spend less time in Norfolk and more time in Christiania. But Maud's attachment to England ran deeper than nostalgia or habit. Her heart remained anchored in the flat Norfolk landscapes, the cold sea air, the sound of English spoken without effort, and the family rituals that had shaped her childhood, and that no amount of Norwegian reinvention could replace. Underscoring this deep, unbreakable connection, her only child, Prince Alexander, who would later take the name Olav and reign as King Olav V of Norway, was born not in Oslo, not in Copenhagen, but at Sandringham, the country house where Maud had grown up, where her brother Eddie had died, where her father had recovered from typhoid, and where her mother would eventually die. The Norwegian heir to the throne drew his first breath in an English country house, a fact that tells you everything about where Maud's truest loyalties resided. Maud's contribution to the Norwegian monarchy operated mostly below the surface of official history, but it was considerable. She brought British prestige, British diplomatic connections, and British financial resources to a fledgling royal house that needed all three in its vulnerable early years. She also brought her own stubborn, athletic, quietly determined personality qualities that served her well in a country that valued directness, physical hardiness, and a willingness to meet the outdoors on its own terms, rather than retreating to a heated drawing room at the first sign of weather. She died in London on November 20, 1938, at the age of 68, shortly after undergoing abdominal surgery. Her death came barely a year before the outbreak of the war that would test the Norwegian monarchy to its absolute limits, a war in which her son, King Olav, would flee the Nazi invasion, rally Norwegian resistance from exile in London, and return to a liberated Oslo in 1945 as a national hero. Maud did not live to see any of it, not the invasion, not the exile, not the liberation, not the triumphant return, but the monarchy she helped build, the institution she had grounded with her British connections and her steady presence, and her willingness to show up even when she would rather have been walking a dog in Norfolk, survive the worst storm of the 20th century and emerge stronger on the other side. The last child of Edward and Alexandra has no biography. He barely fills a paragraph, though the paragraph he fills carries a weight that statistics and genealogies cannot measure. Prince Alexander John Charles Albert arrived on April 6, 1871, at Sandringham. Born dangerously premature after Alexandra suffered a severe bout of rheumatic fever during the final weeks of her pregnancy. The fever attacked Alexandra's heart and joints, weakening her body at the moment it needed strength most, and the baby arrived weeks before he was ready, too small, too fragile, too unfinished for the world he had entered. He was christened immediately. The names piled on with desperate haste because the family understood, from the moment the child drew his first labored breath, that there would be no formal ceremony later. Alexander John Charles Albert, 4 names for a life that would not last long enough to use any of them. He lived for 24 hours. On April 7, 1871, he died, having never left Sandringham, having never grown strong enough to do anything but exist briefly a flutter of heartbeat and breath in a Norfolk bedroom, and then stop. Alexandra's response was devastating in its intensity. She pleaded to keep the baby's body in her room, weeping over him for days, refusing to release him to the undertakers with a ferocity that startled even a household accustomed to the extravagant mourning rituals of the Victorian era. She held on to her dead child the way she would later hold on to Eddie's bedroom, with a grief so total and so physical that it seemed to reject the very concept of death as final, as though sheer force of maternal anguish could reverse what biology had already decided. Edward, for once, set aside his social calendar and stayed close to his wife. He comforted her with a tenderness and a patience that rarely appeared in the accounts of their marriage, a relationship defined by his infidelities, her jealousies, and the vast emotional distance that separated a man who craved excitement from a woman who craved devotion. The loss of Alexander John revealed something about both of them that ordinary life kept hidden: Alexandra's capacity for all-consuming operatic grief, and Edward's ability, when the moment demanded it and the distraction of pleasure was insufficient, to be present for someone else's pain. Alexander John is a footnote in the history of the British monarchy, a name on a family tree, a date in a parish register, an entry in the Sandringham baptismal records. He has no Wikipedia article worth reading, no biographer, no portrait beyond a few faded photographs that may or may not survive. He existed for a single day in a single house in Norfolk, and then he vanished into the vast, indifferent machinery of royal genealogy, swallowed by the same system that gave his siblings their titles, their duties, their tragedies, and their place in history. Edward VII fathered 6 children, and the lives they led trace the full spectrum of royal experience in an age when monarchy itself was transforming violently, irreversibly from a medieval institution rooted in divine right and dynastic inheritance into a modern one defined by public performance, constitutional constraint, and the relentless scrutiny of a press that had discovered royalty sold newspapers. Eddie, the firstborn, died before he could become the disaster everyone feared, or, just possibly, the surprise no one expected. We will never know which version of King Albert Victor would have emerged under the pressure of the crown, and the British Constitution is probably better for the uncertainty remaining forever theoretical. George, the second son who never planned to rule, became the king his brother never could have been: dull, dependable, stubborn as a barnacle on a hull, and exactly right for an era that needed a steady hand more than a brilliant mind. His reign bridged the gap between the Edwardian fantasy and the brutal realities of total war, class revolution, and imperial decline, and if he held the bridge through sheer doggedness rather than vision, that was enough, more than enough. Louise vanished into the private life she always craved, granted her wish at the cost of a husband killed by the aftershock of a shipwreck and a public existence so minimal it barely registered on the national consciousness. Toria, the smartest and sharpest of the siblings, watched her life drain away in her mother's service year after year of telephone calls, social arrangements, and quiet desperation, a sacrifice that earned her nothing but George's love and a decade of belated independence before death collected her too. Maud, the tomboy who climbed trees and rode horses and never expected to be anything more than a Danish naval wife, became a queen through the random machinery of European nationalism and dynastic calculation, and built a monarchy that outlasted empires, survived Nazi occupation, and endures in Oslo to this day. And Alexander John breathed for a single day and then stopped, a ghost in the family record, mourned with a ferocity that revealed more about his mother's character than his own brief existence could ever convey. 6 children, 6 lives shaped by privilege, constricted by duty, and marked every one of them by the particular loneliness that comes from growing up inside an institution that treats human beings as instruments of continuity. Edward VII gave them titles, estates, and a front-row seat to the most dramatic period in modern European history. What he could not give them, what no parent can give, king or commoner, regardless of the wealth or power at their disposal, was a guarantee that any of it would lead to happiness. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the family of Edward VII, head over to our podcast for even more stories from the tangled, bloody, endlessly fascinating world of royal history. And while you're here, drop a like, hit subscribe, and leave a comment telling us which of Edward's children you'd most want to share a drink with. Personally, I'd choose Toria. Anyone with that much gossip, that sharp a tongue, and that many decades of bottled-up frustration would be absolutely lethal company over a gin and tonic. See you in the next one.